Your cardiac output is how much blood is leaving the heart every time it beats. Okay, now there are a couple of things that affect cardiac output. The biggest two are going to be your heart rate and your stroke volume. So you will see that oftentimes kind of represented as a formula as CO equals HR times SV, which is heart rate times stroke volume. Now, of course, heart rate is how many times it's beating per minute. Stroke volume is the amount of blood that is ejected from the left ventricle with each contraction, and it's measured in milliliters. The average cardiac output is about 4.9 liters per minute, so that's almost all of your blood every minute, which is pretty awesome. We know that the heart rate can be controlled by the nervous system, or it is automatically under control by the SA node. But the stroke volume has a little more variability and some things kind of built into it that can make it a little easier to adjust sometimes than just a heart rate itself. But whenever our body is not maintaining homeostasis adequately enough, it will try to adjust the stroke volume or the heart rate. So the ways that it can adjust the stroke volume, it will look on preload. And now preload is just how much blood is coming back to the heart for every beat. Okay, your contractility of the heart. If we can squeeze a little bit more, then we can get kind of like you squeeze the last little bit out of the toothpaste tube. You can get that last little bit out and maybe increase it by a few millimeters. And then afterload. Afterload is sometimes also known kind of as systemic vascular resistance. So your afterload is the pressure that your heart has to pump against to get the blood out of the ventricle and into the circulatory system. Now, the Frank-Starling law is going to be essentially the harder the heart has to work to pump, the stronger it will get, the bigger the muscle, because if you work a muscle, you get bigger. But like with anything, if you work it too much, it can get kind of like muscle bound, or it won't work as well. It gets kind of floppy and less efficient. You think about kind of like those 80s bodybuilders, 1980s bodybuilders, where they had like those huge muscles, but their muscles like in their trapezius and arms are so big they couldn't put the arms down by their side. So, even though they had the big muscles and should be strong, it affected their functionality. So think of that as kind of with that. Your Frank-Starling law, up to a certain point, your increased work will make it stronger and better, and then it becomes. Now, as far as our vascular system, there's a couple of different circulatory systems within the main vascular system. So we've got systemic circulation, which is the aorta out to the body and then back to the heart. So that's just the complete loop throughout the entire body. All right. The peripheral circulation is going to be what's closer to the surface of the body, and this is what in adults we're going to see. The alpha-1 is going to cause some constriction here from the epinephrine. And so if you have shunting, if you have some form of shock forming, then one of the initial responses is going to be to kind of reroute from the peripherals, because that can go a little while without as much blood flow. So it's going to reroute that blood, try to keep it closer into the heart, the lungs, the brain. Now, central circulation is the blood in the large arteries and the supply of blood to the internal organs. So when we shunt away from the peripheral circulation, we're shunting to the central circulation. You also have something called like the hepatic portal circulation. And what that is a kind of a mini vascular system within the liver itself that's going to help break down and digest and detoxify things. Now, arterial blood pressure is the force the blood is going to exert against the walls of the artery as it's coming through. And this is measured in millimeters of mercury, which you may recognize as how we also measure blood pressure. Now, the systolic blood pressure is the highest in ventricular systole, which means at contraction. All right, your diastolic is a lower pressure, and this is the constant. This is the at relaxation, or ventricular diastole. So at relaxation. This is why a very high diastolic can be very concerning, because that means your residual pressure is really high. Now, normally when we obtain these, we're going to measure them as systolic blood pressure over your diastolic blood pressure. And typically your normal adult BP to be less than 120 systolic and less than 80 diastolic. But it's important to note that this blood pressure can vary with every single heartbeat. So a lot of times what we will look at is the mean arterial pressure, or the MAP. Now, calculating this MAP means you have to have another value, which is the pulse pressure, because the MAP is going to be the diastolic blood pressure plus 1/3 of the pulse pressure. So your pulse pressure is just the difference between your systolic and diastolic. So for example, if your blood pressure was 120 over 80, your pulse pressure would be 40. Okay, so in that situation, 1/3 of your pulse pressure, so 40 times 0.33 for 1/3 is going to give you 13.2. Add that to your diastolic, which was 80, and that's going to give you a mean arterial pressure of 93.2, which is great. We want our MAP to be greater than 60 to ensure adequate cerebral perfusion. Now, as far as things that can influence this blood pressure overall, of course, the function of the heart. If the heart itself is not functioning, it doesn't matter how much blood you've got in there, it's not going to be adequate enough to circulate. The volume of the blood, you've got to make sure that you've got enough blood in there, otherwise we're pumping on an empty system. And then the capacity of the vascular system, it's got to hold it all in there and keep it in there. Right? And kind of like with the garden hose, if you ever sprayed water for watering flowers or grass or something, if you don't have anything over the hose, it comes out and it has some force and it goes a little ways, but it doesn't go very far. If you put your thumb over the end of it and narrow that lumen, then your pressure is going to increase significantly coming out, and it's going to go a lot further. So kind of apply that concept to your vessels. If your vessels are a little bit smaller, a little tighter, then they're going to help keep that resistance there so that the blood can travel further. But it's a balancing game. We don't want it to go too tight because then it's not going to go far enough. The heart's going to have to work too hard, but we don't want it too big because then we don't have enough pressure to even get it through the whole circulatory system. One of the ways that our body is always going to work to maintain this homeostasis, if you have, say, a loss of blood volume, okay, that's going to lead to decreased blood coming back to the heart, which is preload. Decreased preload is going to lead to decreased cardiac output and then decreased blood pressure because we're not moving as much blood. On the other end, if we increase cardiac output and we increase that systemic vascular resistance, then that's going to increase the blood pressure. And your body has a lot of built-in mechanisms to kind of keep this all in balance. If you get too much volume, when the atria stretch, the cells secrete this substance which is going to stimulate vasodilation, so it's going to help lower that blood pressure, and it's also going to suppress a mechanism that creates fluid retention. Now, if we are running on low cardiac output, then that renin-angiotensin-aldosterone system may be activated, which will help increase the blood pressure. So it all just depends on what the body's needs are at that particular point in time.